Mensa,
And I'm Heidi Pre.
and today we're talking about cognitive functions once again. We're doing our series. Last week we talked about what exactly the cognitive functions are. And just a quick reminder, there are eight of them, but everybody uses four of them primarily. So you have your dominant function, which is your first one, your auxiliary function, which is your second one, your tertiary function, which is your third one, and then your inferior function, which is your fourth one. And the lower down the scale they go, the kind of like weaker they are. So your dominant and your auxiliary are the most used functions that you have, pretty much. And those are the two that you use on, like, you're most skilled at, pretty much. And we're deep diving into all eight of the functions. And today we're starting with NE, which happens to be what Heidi leads with as an ENFP. Well, NE is extroverted intuition. And this is the dominant function of ENFPs, ENTPs, and then the auxiliary or second function for INFPs and INTPs.
It's definitely an interesting function because it has a lot of similarities to both SC and NI, but in very different ways. So I
Yeah.
those are two functions it kind of gets almost confused with sometimes. But it is really its own unique and distinct function. But I think, in my opinion, it's one of the lesser understood functions in the MBTI world. I see it getting confused with SE all the time. I see it kind of getting muddled, like people who don't use an N function might think it's more similar to NI than it is, the same way intuitives seem to think SI and SE are very similar, where they're not at all. So it's going to be fun. It's going to be cool to get down and dirty and clarify that. But I broke it down into like three kind of main things that I think describe NE really well. So the first is future orientation. And I'm going to take some time and expand upon that because it's future orientation in a very different way than NI is future oriented. But I think that's one of the main distinguishing factors of NE is that it's always oriented towards the future. It's not very interested in the past. In fact, it tends to look down on the past and kind of go, okay, that's done. We don't have anything to learn from it. The present's not really interesting. It's kind of stressful to deal with the present as an NE user. But the future is like where all the good, juicy mental stuff is. We like to spend our time kind of mentally dwelling in the future. And the second thing that I put as like kind of a classic NE trait is having a focus on theory. So what distinguishes NE from SE most predominantly, in my opinion, is that SE is very interested in what's applicable, what's actionable, what can we do. NE is very interested in connecting the dots. So it likes to look at things and understand how they relate to other things. So that's that transcontextual thinking. So looking at one thing and going, oh my God, this is a brilliant metaphor for this other thing. Or wow, if we connected this to this, like magic would happen. Or why has no one thought to like make this and like in the future, like this might combine with this and then this would happen. Like it's all about those kind of what ifs, but they're all oriented towards the future. So future orientation, theoretical, and also just a focus on this is maybe more NEFI, but inspiration. And I see that in a more logical way with NTs as well. So INTPs and ENTPs. It's all about getting kind of excited and inspired about what could be that currently isn't. So NE is all about exploring the unknown and exploring the undefined and the unknowable. So that's another thing that kind of separates it from SE. I like to say SE is about exploring what we have and understanding how things can tangibly work together in the world that we're living in. And NE is all about exploring what could be, what might be. Like I always say, like Black Mirror is the most NE show that I've ever seen because it's all about like, oh, what about this
Yeah.
twist dystopia in the future? What about this twisted dystopian future? That's kind of like the epitome of NE to me is looking at the possibilities of what could be in the future.
What do you think about Carl Jung? Like, from what I understand from the Archetypes book, he was saying that NE was kind of like a function where you see the potential somewhere, and then you make sure that you go and try and like actualize that potential in a way. And so, one example could even be like if an NE user, and he said that this could even be like this mostly had to do with like minorities, for example. I don't know. And so this could be an example of like maybe an INFP or an ENFP. They could see potential in maybe cause for like animals or something to like connect and then like stand up for them in some sense, or maybe an ENTP or an INTP can see potential in innovating a system, and that excitement of that potential makes them want to go and like follow through and make it happen in some shape or form. Do you see that like actually being a thing that you've seen with other like any users, or do I have the interpretation a little bit mixed up?
Yeah, no, I think that definitely works. I think that's almost, in my opinion, like a bit of an idealized version of any, because I think where a lot of any users struggle is with the follow through. So I think
Mm,
we're tend to be like, especially dominant any users, we tend to be like idea people and like kind of your like serial entrepreneur who like always has a new idea, always has a new project on the go. But then, you know, sometimes it's the actualizing of it that is difficult for us because it requires like using our inferior sensing in order to like follow through on things. Which isn't to say that any users don't finish what they start; they often do. But I think that it's the actualizing of it that can give us the most difficulty. But definitely
mm.
seeing that potential. I love the word potential for any. That's such a good description of like what the function's all about. I kind of see it as like a springboard almost. So like any is kind of like you jump on it with one idea and it's almost like you explode into the air with like all these ways that something could go. So you see that
Mm.
potential and then it kind of goes outwards into like, okay, we could do it this way, we could do it this way, we could do it this way. This might happen, this might happen, this might happen. And we really enjoy kind of following all of those possibilities and all of those trains of thought. So we'll kind of
Mm.
see potential in something, and we also see a lot of kind of smaller. It's almost like an explosion that like bursts off into like other little explosions like of ideas. So you see the
Wow.
potential and there's potential in this idea. Okay, there's three different ways we could do it. Cool. And then within those three different ways we could do it, there's like, okay, this would have this result, this would have this result, and this would have this result. Ooh, what if we could find
Wow.
a result with this result? So it's a lot of it's a lot of like it's like a little idea explosion that that like builds upon itself and then also tries to like mingle with itself. So there's a lot happening with any. Like anytime an any user gets an idea, it can be kind of overwhelming, and you have to really make sure you're like using your other functions in order to keep yourself or understand how to actually make that idea happen, as opposed to just getting too excited about it and not really reining it in enough to like make something of it, which I think is something young any users struggle with.
Well, I was trying to like gather all of my thoughts on NE. Some of the notes that I wrote down was it's innovative and connects real things together and figures out power relations. It moves from the one to the many because it isn't concerned with necessarily combining slash condensing objects together, but rather understanding them for what they objectively are and then seeing and connecting them to all the various associated objects. And then I heard an example that pretty much an NE user could look at a block of gold and see that looks like a block of cheddar. Then it leads the NE user to wonder what would happen if the block of gold was to be made into a sculpture of cheese. And this is why NE is good at like puns and similes pretty much, because it connects like actual objects to other objects. And then another example that I heard was if an any user is shown like a red balloon, it may relate it to the process of which latex is created in the state of the latex industry, and then the decline in quality of the red balloons, and then what that might do. Next thing you know, any has made or drawn a duck out of scrap parts to avoid latex. And I thought that was like very interesting because pretty much the whole concept was that NE being an extroverted function is like an objective function that um, compares real things to each other. Do you know what I'm saying? Like they can compare one thing to another thing. Like they can see the relationship between one thing and another thing so quickly and just come up with it. And even within ESFJ that I know, like even when he's like making fun of people or joking around with them, that he can like compare the person to some abstract character that's like, oh wow, how did you see that resemblance?
Of the two examples you used, I really like the one with like the balloon and like wondering about the state of the latex industry and like what would happen if this. And then I really relate to that one. I don't relate to looking at a block of gold and seeing a block of because that's a very sensory oriented connection, right? So I would actually see that one as SE. Like I would see SE looking at two things and seeing how they resemble each other. Whereas any kind of expands into theory, like necessarily. So it kind of looks at one thing and goes like, well, what if we like put it in a different context? What if we looked at it from or like how it kind of looks at the circumstances surrounding the thing as opposed to just relating it to another thing. So it kind of overcomplicates everything. So it might look at a block of gold and be like, wow, I wonder what gold is going to be used for in like 50 years. And like, ooh, how would that change? What if we have like a different currency in like 50 years? Like, how would the world change if we like had to go back to not having any currency and had to like just go back to the barter system? And like, what would that mean now in the digital age? So they more look for like the theory behind connecting things. As opposed to just object relation. Like I would say it's more about putting objects into a system, whether that's a logical system or like an emotional system, and then seeing how they relate to each other within that system. So yeah, I would say it's always about realizing things and then almost realizing like where you could break context and like mess with something. If that makes it, does that make sense?
Yeah.
I literally think that half the definitions you see of any out there are SE and they're being confused, but there's so much overlap. There's so much overlap between those two functions. But I think the main difference is like, are you looking at what's happening now and how that connects to other things that are happening now? And then understanding what's likely to happen in the future based on what's happening now, because that's SE and NI. Or are you looking at like all these kind of unconstrained possibilities of like what could be in the future and then bringing it back down to, okay, how could we like make that, like, how could we make it happen? How could we be consistent enough to like make that a reality, which is like whichever one you pick to go with, which is SI.
Then, just to clarify, would you disagree with this statement and actually say that it's SE? Another example that I heard was NE connects the dots and it may associate the patent system of America with the economic happenings on the Nile River,
Yes.
which are two real things. And NE is concerned with objective associations and relations between actual objects and happenings.
I think object orientation, the way that Jung uses the term, is like different than how we might think of it nowadays. Because I think when we hear object orientation, we tend to hear like real things you can like hold, like my phone is an object, whatever. And well, that's part of what Jung was saying when he would use the term object orientation. I think he used it more in terms of like external orientation. So he uses that term a lot when he talks about extroverted functions. So like the world that exists outside your mind. But NE's a tricky one because it's about the world that exists outside your mind, but it's about the theoretical world outside your mind, not like the real one. Like one thing that's a big distinguisher, and I will get to, I'll get to what you said, but a big distinguisher is like NE tends to be very tuned out of its external environment. Like we have to really focus to like pay attention to like the color of this or what someone's wearing or like how something looks or like the nuances of like how something sounds or smells. Whereas SE is hyper in tune with all of those things. Whereas NE is usually a little bit more tuned out because we're looking at like, we notice how one thing looks and then we're like, oh, interesting. Like, I wonder how it got to be like that. And like, how would it look if this were different or like if it hadn't rained this year and then like, ooh, what if like it didn't rain for 100 years and then there was a drought? Like, so we kind of very quickly spiral off in our heads as soon as we notice like one sensory thing and start thinking about how it could be different. Whereas SE takes in things as they are. And it might wonder how it could be different, but in a more realistic way. Back to your example of like relating how one thing is like another thing. Yes, that is definitely NE. It definitely takes one thing as like a metaphor for another thing, which is often why it's really good at coming up with like really solutions because it almost maps an idea. So it'll go, okay, this theory works over here. How could we map what we have over here to kind of follow that and like then that's kind of like a fusion of ideas. Like idea fusion is really an any thing. So if we look at one thing, we see similarities to another system, we look at like how we could use that idea and apply it to this system or this mode of understanding this thing in order to understand it from a different angle or like in a new way, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, yeah. Okay, I think I have one last question before we can like actually like move on. So another thing that I'd read, this one was Carl Jung, was he said that NE dominants especially are like what we would see as like the actual salesmen and like consmen. And ironically, this is one where I was like, huh, I would have really expected that to actually be the ESTP mostly and like ESFPs. But you know, it's like it's Carl Jung, so it's like, okay, well maybe I have it twisted, but yeah, what do you think about that?
I'm here for it. That's one thing, like people are always like, oh, but Jung said it. I'm like, yeah, but we know we've built on this theory now, so we should and can question what Jung said. But I would actually agree with both. So I would definitely agree with you, Denzel, that normally I would associate like the idea of like being a con man, not that you're necessarily doing it for evil, but like having that mindset, that ability to like see opportunity and understand how you could like work a system to kind of to your advantage. I would primarily associate with SE. SE is more like, here's where we're at now. Here's how we can work this system to our advantage. NE is more like, here's how I could manipulate this system or this situation in order to make it start functioning differently to my advantage. Just to kind of like wrap up like the differences between them. It's like NE is almost like, it's like the future focus of NI. I'm going to do that thing you usually do. But like, it's like the future focus of NI with the manipulative resourcefulness of SE. So it kind of looks at how things could be manipulated in the future. Whereas like NI looks at what's going to happen, SE looks at what is happening, and NE kind of is like a weird fusion of those things where it looks at what could happen based on what's currently happening and like where opportunities for the future are within that.
Okay.
Whew.
Well, I think we wrapped that up. 45 minutes on the dot.
Perfect. Yeah, we will see you guys next week.
For sure. Done.
I'm David Bowder, CEO of SPASIGMA. Every day, each of us is surrounded by a great diversity of people, and indeed, personalities. Some people we find it very easy to relate to. Others, not so much so. Our program exists to help you make sense of your own personality, as well as the diverse personalities around you, to help you improve both your personal and professional lives. Shakespeare said, "To thine own self be true." We'll teach you to understand how to reach the diverse personalities around you, to communicate with them in a way that integrates who you are with who they are. So enough talk about all this. Welcome to SPASIGMA's Personality Quotient PQ program. Enjoy the journey.